Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is Gennady Stolyarov II. Today we shall discuss the recently discovered US-Libyan cooperation on torture and what it illustrates regarding the evils of US foreign policy. First, let's delve into the facts. Workers from Human Rights Watch recently discovered documents in Libya demonstrating that the Gaddafi regime was not always an enemy of the US. Indeed, for a brief period between 2002 and 2004, the CIA illegally handed several so-called suspected militants to the Gaddafi regime as part of its so-called extraordinary rendition program. Now, when I see terms like extraordinary rendition, I recognize them as euphemistic. When euphemisms like that are used, they're used to cover up an activity that would be unsavory to most decent, conscientious people if the actual name for the activity were stated. So what extraordinary rendition is illegal kidnapping and torture. The kinds of activities that the CIA and other US federal government agencies know would not be permissible or tolerated by US citizens if performed on US soil are essentially outsourced to other countries where the regimes do not have such stated scruples. This kind of euphemism reminds me of the term quantitative easing, used by the Fed to discuss money printing, money creation out of thin air, a rampantly inflationary policy that it currently pursues. Continuing on, this cooperation in illegal kidnapping and torture existed in order to repair relations with the Gaddafi regime after decades of a falling out with the West. Once Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq was threatened with a Western occupation, Gaddafi decided not to aggravate the West in the same way, so he decided to try to cooperate with the West in fighting, quote, terrorism and essentially helping the US and the British interrogate terror suspects. Now, lest you think the CIA was the only agency involved, the British Secret Service, the MI6 agency, was in on it too. And lest you think that interrogating suspected terrorists was all that was done, the so-called renditions were also explicitly focused on handing to Gaddafi prominent dissidents and critics of his regime. So this was not just about fighting terrorism. Gaddafi needed to be appeased as well. He wasn't just going to do the bidding of the West. So he wanted the people who cried out for freedom, who criticized his policies, who weren't happy with his rule, brought back to Libya. Even if they had sought refuge in the West, they were kidnapped, brought back to Libya, and tortured there. How very, very complimentary of the human rights record of the US and Britain. Now we clearly know that they have consistently opposed the human rights abuses of the Gaddafi regime, and they have consistently lent a helping hand to the dissidents who pointed out that regime's monstrous abuses. One of the people handed over, tortured, and imprisoned until 2009 was Abdel Hakim Belhaj, the current commander of the Libyan rebels in Tripoli. He was kidnapped from Thailand in 2004, together with his pregnant wife. Think about that. The man may have been suspected of terrorism, but what did his pregnant wife and the unborn child have to do with it? And now, this man has spent 5 years in abominable conditions in a Libyan prison. So the US taxpayers paid to get a possibly innocent man imprisoned and tortured. We don't really know what the nature of his activities in the past had been, whether he had actually engaged in anything that threatened innocent civilians. And then US taxpayers paid again for the same man to overthrow the regime that tortured and imprisoned him after having given aid for several years to the same regime. So I have to congratulate US foreign policy and British foreign policy for violating the law of non-contradiction, at least across time, in pretty much every conceivable permutation in this scenario. And this is, I think, quite a feat. Continuing on with the facts, let's examine the degree of culpability that the MI6 and CIA had. According to Peter Buchert, the Human Rights Watch Emergencies Director, the MI6 and the CIA knew absolutely how much torture was taking place. They knew that these people would be abused in custody when they were sent back to Libya. And this is not just Human Rights Watch speaking. In 2005, the US State Department published a report on human rights in Libya, stating in part that security forces reportedly subjected detainees to cruel, inhumane, or degrading conditions and denied adequate medical care, which led to several deaths in custody. Now, this is a US federal government agency writing this, basing this on well-known facts at the time, contemporaneously with another US federal government agency deliberately kidnapping both suspected militants and Libyan dissidents from around the world and subjecting them to these cruel, inhumane, and degrading conditions which have been documented in the US government's own records. Now, if that's not the utmost culpability, if that's not clear and evident knowledge of what they were putting these people through, with no due process, no right to a fair trial, no right to hear the charges against them, no right to competent legal defense, then I don't know what culpability means. So who is responsible? Obviously, there were many rank-and-file CIA agents and MI6 agents and agents of the Libyan intelligence service that perpetrated these abuses. But let's take a look at the leaders. Moussa Koussa was the head of the Libyan intelligence agency at the time, and he has a well-known, notorious reputation for torture and cruelty. But now that he has defected from the Gaddafi regime, he has escaped any sort of punishment. George Tenet was director of the CIA from 1997 through early 2004, when much of this kidnapping and torture took place. And his successor, Porter J. Goss, was director of the CIA from 2004 to 2006, also during part of the period when these kidnappings took place. In Britain, we also had two individuals in charge of the MI6. The first was Richard Dearlove from 1999 to 2004, and the second was John M. Scarlett from 2004 to 2009. I think all of these individuals had a role to play in facilitating these kidnappings. Indeed, correspondence between Moussa Koussa and various US and British intelligence officials revealed that they were indeed on quite chummy terms with one another, sometimes on a first-name basis, sometimes making very friendly comments that would be an understatement, and promising various favors and exchanges of gratitude to one another. It's really quite disgusting. And of course, we cannot leave the leaders of all of these countries blameless. George W. Bush and his puppet master, Vice President Richard Cheney at the time, Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, and Muammar al-Gaddafi, who, of course, is the primary instigator of the cruelties that took place in Libya. His regime set, essentially, the facilities necessary for the torture to take place. He created the climate that the US and British intelligence officials considered appealing enough to send their victims to when they didn't feel like they could get away with perpetrating certain acts on these people in the US or in Britain. Now, if these aren't crimes against humanity, I don't know what are crimes against humanity. But it's really telling that none of these individuals have yet been brought to justice. When in the Western world it's suggested that George W. Bush or Tony Blair should be tried for crimes against humanity, many people would just roll their eyes. I think if it's suggested now that Gaddafi should be tried for crimes against humanity, there would be a little bit more of a positive reception. But really, they are all culpable in this unconscionable kidnapping and torture. So why hold a double standard? If Gaddafi should be tried for crimes against humanity, so should the heads of all of these intelligence agencies. So should the leaders of the Western powers that countenanced this kind of appalling treatment. I think this particular incident is quite illustrative of more general US foreign policy approaches. So let's review some basic US foreign policy principles. Basic Principle 1. Help heinous regimes dispose of threats that your earlier policy created. Very important. Without those heinous regimes, well, you might just get a saner and more rational approach to threats, a more contained approach, and we can't have that. Basic principle 2. Dispose of the same heinous regimes, preferably with maximum cost and bloodshed, once they become too inconvenient, embarrassing, or uncooperative. As long as working together with the heinous regimes is in the immediate short-term interest of US foreign policy, then keep doing it. But if they get too far out of line or they step on the wrong toes, then it's time for another bombing campaign. Basic principle 3. Always enlist prospective future threats in fulfilling basic principle 2. This is very important. You can't competently dispose of a heinous regime according to US foreign policy unless you plant the seeds of a future heinous regime or a militant group or some other nasty inconvenience we don't yet know about. But you always need to have some of these people on your side, whether you're overthrowing the Soviet-backed occupants of Afghanistan or the theocratic regime in Iran, or Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq, or Gaddafi's regime in Libya, whomever you're trying to undermine. You always need to sow the seeds of future conflicts for the US to get involved in. Basic principle 4. Require US taxpayers to fund the implementation of basic principles 1 through 3. The taxpayers must also pay for the deaths of thousands of US troops, as well as the killing, maiming, and torturing of innocent people. No US foreign policy approach is complete without that, and no matter at what stage you are, whether you are helping build up a heinous regime or dispose of that heinous regime with a future heinous regime or terrorist group, the US taxpayer will always pay, and innocent people will always suffer. You can't have US foreign policy without that, now can you? And basic principle 5, freedom, integrity, due process. What antiquated notions. I mean, this is the 21st century, people. Those kinds of concepts were for the 18th century, back when you had the American Revolution and the Enlightenment and principles of individual rights, back when it was considered intolerable to subject someone to criminal penalties without first letting them know what the charges against them were, without first letting them go through a speedy and fair trial with a jury of their peers and adequate legal counsel. That was back during the barbarous 18th century. Now, in the 21st century, we are much more enlightened than that. And, of course, we have new threats. Obviously, you can't have 18th century antiquated notions dealing with the unique new threats of 21st century terrorism. No, no, no. I mean, we can't have objective, absolute moral principles that apply to all times and places. Everything is relative to our specific situation and our convenience and the whims of the people in charge. It would be ridiculous to assume anything to the contrary. And, of course, some illustrative examples of these basic principles of US foreign policy are the way in which the US approached Iraq under Saddam Hussein, first greatly aiding him both militarily and in terms of money during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, and then going back and bombing his regime, imposing sanctions on his regime, and ultimately overthrowing his regime. During the 1980s, the US also aided the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the future Taliban and Al-Qaeda, in order to overthrow the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And now we have another excellent example to add to how the US really fulfills the basic principles of its foreign policy. The treatment of Gaddafi in Libya. First, you repair relations, you suck up to the Gaddafi regime, you hand over critics for torture and mutilation and imprisonment, and then you go ahead and bomb that same regime and help overthrow it. Once again, this US foreign policy really violates every conceivable permutation of the law of non-contradiction. You can't have a more prominent accomplishment in that particular area than US foreign policy has already attained. Now, what do the American founders have to say on this? Now, surely this enlightened 21st century US foreign policy would have had some sort of backing from them. Did it? What's this? It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Not just with heinous dictators, but with any portion of the foreign world. Who said that? George Washington in his farewell address in 1799. Doesn't seem like something that characterizes US foreign policy today. Here's another quote. Equal and exact justice to all men, of whatever state or persuasion, religious or political. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. No entangling alliances. No bombings of other countries. Just peace and commerce and honest friendship without regard for religious or political persuasion. Who said that? Thomas Jefferson in his first inaugural address in 1801. Here we have these antiquated 18th century and early 19th century notions of peaceful commerce and no entangling alliances, no wasting of money and blood and integrity that characterized 21st century US foreign policy. Clearly, the founders didn't understand the basic principles of US foreign policy. Clearly, they didn't understand why it's necessary to help heinous regimes one day and then overthrow them the next to prop up future heinous regimes while killing and torturing many, many innocent people. Clearly, the founders didn't grasp that. But maybe I don't grasp it either. Here's a sampling of sources if you want to read more about the recent discoveries pertaining to the US-Libyan cooperation under the Gaddafi regime in kidnapping and torturing suspected militants and dissidents. And of course, this story is all over the web. I encourage you to look up other articles and other perspectives on the matter. But if this isn't disgraceful, I don't know what is.